We are starting our final session of our Arthur Szyk Symposium with a special speaker because he is the curator of the exhibition that is on view up in the Bellarmine Hall galleries. So please welcome Francesco Spagnolo.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So in 2017, the Magnus, through an unprecedented gift to the University of California, Berkeley was able to acquire the private collection. We know a lot about that collection from Irv Unger, who's in the audience right now. And it was an important gift, not only because of the magnitude of the collection, because of the content, but also for the gift itself, which also came with funding to really process, catalog, review the whole collection and turn it from a private collection to a public one. So now there is a publicly accessible catalog. And also allowed me, as the curator and on the faculty of UC Berkeley, to sort of deploy the mind of the university around this collection, which involved engaging scholars. So as the collection came in, I planned, sort of like, the similarity are striking with the conversation that has been happening over the last 2 days here, but over 2 semesters, scholars from the Bay Area, from the San Francisco Bay Area came in to discuss topics around Arthur Szyk. And also to really think with students, and as I remind my students, we're at the research university, so what we teach at the research university is not really what we know, is what we're researching. So they were partners in doing that. And at the same time, it's also, this afforded us the possibility of bringing the Arthur Szyk collection into the context of the Magnus collection of Jewish Art and Life, one of the largest Jewish museum collections in the world, the only one that's part of a research university anywhere, not even Israel, has that. And in fact, it was and this you will see as the opening act of the exhibition on display here. We were able to connect the Arthur Szyk collection with another collection came in shortly thereafter, the Roman Vishniak Archive, another unprecedented gift in the history of UC Berkeley, 30,000 images, including portraits of Arthur Szyk at work. So this visual connection about, they arrived to, Arthur Szyk and Roman Vishniak arrived to New York City around the same time. They were active on the Upper West Side in New York in the early 40s. And so you see the connections there and the relations there. But part of the whole process of studying, documenting, cataloging, and thinking about an exhibition and a narrative had to do with essentially decoding Arthur Szyk. He is visible in plain sight, but also hides himself. And some of it, I have to say, the work that was done until now made my life very easy today. So a lot of what I was going to say echoes in the presentation, including the one that immediately preceded me, but you will see some familiar images and some familiar ideas here. So essentially how to go deep into these materials, how to think truly, and how to build narratives. Now, what I'm going to do today is not going so much, as Gav did earlier, into the meta, but actually the opposite, going to the infra, kind of guide you into the process of creating an exhibition and studying this artist. And one thought that I had in moving into this artist was actually, which linked eventually the narrative of the exhibition around global human rights, was one of the greatest episodes in 20th century art history that most likely never happened, which is the alleged visit of a Nazi officers to the studio of Pablo Picasso in Paris. Picasso lived in Paris during the Nazi occupation of the city. And the story, it's now confirmed also by Wikipedia, so it must be true. The story is that the Nazi officer looked at Guernica, Picasso had worked on Guernica, and said, "You did this?" And Picasso answered, "No, you did it." And in a way, this is very much what animated my work, my curatorial work, my scholarly work around this exhibition and this collection. So again, you did it, and the self-portraits, the many self-portraits, we saw one before, one now, of Arthur Szyk in uniform, link him to actually the ideas of the 20th century artistic avant-gardes. As a reminder, avant-garde in French is a military term. It means the front line of an army. It's a fighting artistic army, and the avant-garde started during World War I. Dada starts in Zurich in 1916, in a moment of global upheaval and conflict, and so on. So I felt that Arthur Szyk could be rooted into that avant-garde tradition, and at the same time posed another problem. Now, I was sharing other things with you in how we studied this, but the videos didn't go through, so we actually also, with students, cropped, redesigned, reanimated his work, so you can find this online as a short video where all the elements come into play in different ways, etc. But one of the key contexts, of this was to see that Arthur Szyk, who is at this, even though it can be brought into the context of avant-garde and sort of militant and activist art, is also an artist who is a great artist in a category of one. I think one of the red threads of all the conversations we heard so far is that it's really hard to find fellow travelers. Now, the fellow travelers that we found in this process with the help of students and colleagues on campus was to really see his biography, his life, his work in the context of the rise and especially the fall of global human rights. So another centerpiece of the exhibition we'll see is this apparently simple chronology, not so simple, that kind of documents the fall of European democracy one by one, starting in 1920s, a great contribution by my fellow countrymen, and especially Benito Mussolini, who's featured in the exhibition, also with his pants down, a different one. I couldn't resist as an Italian in doing that. But another way in which I could sort of conceive this narrative was to really think about human rights in the context of art as within the context of what I call an aesthetics of extreme situations. Essentially, how does art deal with representing what most of us consider hard, or it's not impossible to represent? How does Arthur Szyk deal with the question that Theodor Wiesenthal Adorno raised about the art and poetry after Auschwitz as being a barbaric act, meaning an impossible act? So I find four modalities in which the aesthetics of a extreme situation can be framed, and one is the documentary stance, the idea that essentially history in artwork prevails over art and aesthetic means, that documenting history, and in this case the horrors of history, is more important than how art is actually made. The other is diversion, is finding different topics. One example comes in mind, I know we're not supposed to mention Roman Polanski, but who was a survivor of the Krakow ghetto. His movie on vampires, which is a comedy, is actually really possibly his first movie about the Holocaust, decades before The Pianist, a movie in which the vampires actually do kill people, and most of those victims are actual Jews who are being killed by these blonde and blue-eyed vampires. So even though it's a comedy, it's also not. So diverting the subject is a way of dealing with this. Of course, silence. Silent characters, silence in general, silence in music, void, and pause, simply pause, as ways to give space to what is hard, if not impossible, to represent. And finally, and this is where my scholarship very much comes in, both as a scholar and as a curator, what I call the evocative and narrative power of fragments, essentially the deployment of quotations, pastiche, juxtaposition, and as we will see, ruins, as ruins of the past, to narrate a history and a story of the past and the present. So in the case of Szyk, I would say that 3 out of these 4 categories are firmly met, and I will sort of try and go through them as I also describe for you what I find are the fellow travelers in Arthur Szyk's work, who are not necessarily artists. They are philosophers, jurists, political thinkers, public intellectuals, and also victims, fellow victims of hatred, who are part of the conversation. So a framing text for me was the work of my friend James Leffler, most recently at Virginia, now is in Baltimore, Johns Hopkins, who researched how, and the quote here says it all, but how essentially what we call global human rights today are rooted in minority rights and politics in the interwar period in Eastern Europe, and very much Jewish jurists and Jewish juridical thinkers were at the root of that conversation. And I find Arthur Szyk, and I think we've heard it from the many conversations over the last 2 days, firmly rooted in that tradition. And as we saw, again, I can go very fast through my slides today, which is great, but the Statute of Kalik also is an example of that. It's a reference to the idea of minority rights as a beacon for rights for everyone, essentially for the globalization of rights, civil rights and human rights. Arthur Szyk also finds a variety of companions who are writers, activists, musicians, and so on, and we see it in his work, his activist work in making the Holocaust known in America and helping to try and mobilize the American war machine towards stopping what was going on in Eastern Europe. And so the work that he does is very similar to what emerges from the notes from the Warsaw Ghetto of Emanuel Ringelblum, who had no hope for his own personal survival, but who considered a victory simply entering the extermination of East European Jews into the news cycle. So making into the news cycle was already an act of not just defiance, but of victory in its own right. And so bringing this awareness to the broader public, as he did in participating in this incredible endeavor, first at Madison Square Garden, then at the Hollywood Bowl in Los Angeles, of creating mass celebrations in a way of awareness, a celebration of public awareness, were essential. But he does that also by deploying, as I was saying, fragments and narrative uses of fragments. So jointly with the work with Ben Hecht that we see profiled in the pageant We Will Never Die, he also illustrates a poem by Ben Hecht. And again, we had to decode how Szyk works. So if we look at this document, page, work of art, and poem all at once, was meant for publication in the news, we see a narrative, which is a literary narrative that goes from top to bottom. We can read the poem from the beginning to the end, and we follow it. But if we look at the visual narrative is essentially a collage of fragments that starts at the bottom right rather than at top left of the page. So if we visually look at the page this way with verbal and visual text, we see a narrative that starts with the threat at the bottom and the threat towards destitute people in danger who are trying to, in this case, deploy modern technology, the telephone, to make a phone call that remains unanswered by the United States. And all of this narrative is built through fragments, allusions, quotations, all the way to the Four Freedoms, which are played by a skeletal orchestra that reminds me a little bit of the orchestra on the deck of the Titanic playing while the ship is sinking. So looking for these clues was a way to detect narratives and build narratives around this broader issue of human rights, which continues to emerge through most of Arthur Szyk's work. Another example, again, something that has been explained and examined over this symposium is his work with this big title, De Profundis, which, by the way, even though refers to a text from the Psalms, from the Hebrew Bible, is in Latin. And this is a true expression of Arthur Szyk's being embedded in Polish Christian Catholic culture and really bringing that forth. And all of the clues, the visual and literary clues of the work confirm this, but also the constant deployment of fragments, including, at this point, human and architectural ruins of the past as a way to create narratives, and going into little details like eventually Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, the last words of the Christ on the cross, still penciled in within a letter, and we also saw other symbology in this work. So I will not go any further, but here they are. Of course, and we saw it, Arthur Szyk also deploys the documentary stance of the aesthetics of extreme situations. So, for example, his portrayals of the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto are very much rooted in that. And again, his fellow travelers are those who were there, so victims and fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto. So finding again the works of Mare Edelman. All of these texts that I'm showing are part of the exhibition itself. They're framing texts within the exhibition itself, really help us kind of enter into both the news cycle, to which he was clearly very attuned for every single work he produced, but also to the kind of the zeitgeist of the moment, sometimes really of the hour, of the day, of the half day. And so his depictions of the Warsaw Ghetto are also, in a way, documentary depictions. And we can identify historical documents to your left and historical figures fighting in the Warsaw Ghetto who are portrayed in sort of with his deployment of aesthetic means, but also in a way in a photographic way. So it's a documentary portrayal of history. And the same is true, this coexistence of multiple registers in dealing with the aesthetic of a situation is very true in the portrayal of Hitler. I'm not going to go into we already had talks about the other characters, Casto character, the other members of the Casto character of the Nazi regime, but Hitler is essential in this whole conversation, and very much I find in conversation with both, and we mentioned Charlie Chaplin and also Ernst Lubitsch, and we see that this has followers all the way to today's, or somewhat recent film, Jojo Rabbit, which deploys the very, very, very similar aesthetics and ways of portrayal. And here, again, we see caricature as a blend of both documentary approach, but also a diversion, comedy, as a way to kind of create the necessary distance to bring forth what is perhaps too harsh to conceive. In this case, conceive that somebody like these gentlemen, people like these gentlemen, would be in charge of the destiny of the world, right? And again, fragments, quotations are at the essence of this work, at the essence of this activity, but again, looking and feeling around him and what was being done at the same time as it was doing. And the exhibition also brings forth Charlie Chaplin's own words about his production of The Great Dictator, and both the challenge in producing The Great Dictator, and major studios were trying to stay away, and he wanted to push this forward, as he says, because Hitler must be laughed at. This is towards the beginning of his autobiography. If we keep reading his autobiography, he goes back to The Great Dictator, and he says something very different. Oh, this is Jojo Rabbit, but we'll skip that. Had I known of the actual horrors of the German concentration camps, sorry, this was Mussolini without pants, I could not have made The Great Dictator. I could not have made fun of the homicidal insanity of the Nazis. So essentially, these two stances have to coexist and very much coexist dynamically in Arthur Szyk's work in the depiction of extreme situations. And again, comedy and the news cycle blend here. As I was saying, not only as an Italian, I couldn't resist showing Mussolini with pants down for all kinds of good reasons that are personal and I will not share today, but actually the dedication of this cartoon is equally important and reflects the news cycle of the day. He's dedicating it to Virginio Gaida, who was a fascist critic of Mussolini, a very vocal very fascist critic, and very critical of Benito Mussolini. So the nuance of all these references and allusions in his work have to be examined down to the smallest details, while at the same time trying to pull out and trying to think about what the broader implications are. The same can be said, of course, of Nazi mythologies, and we saw some of them in the preceding lecture, so I'm just going to guide you through. But we see in a work like this one different registers and different characters. And so doing this work of cropping that actually the lecture that preceded me just did in very similar ways is the work that also we did with students digitally to try and find all the elements and the modularity of the work in Arthur Szyk's production, and really finding the various streams of narratives, while at the same time echoing what he was doing and anchoring into even today's legacies. One example is, as the exhibition was about to open, the news cycle was hit by the then essentially Minister of Culture, not really called that way, but Minister of Culture under Bolsonaro in Brazil, who gave a public speech on television, essentially quoting directly from a speech by Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda of the Hitler regime. And we see how Arthur Szyk sees the legacies of fascism even into the future, because one of the works that's framing the exhibition is this work that depicts essentially a legacy in which, just like Satan leads this whole parade of horrible characters in the work we saw in the last presentation, here is Adolf Hitler that leads a parade of Latin American dictators, one after the other. And this year is the 40th anniversary of the end of the dictatorship in Argentina, which followed the exact same playbook, as we know, unfortunately, quite well, but probably not well enough. So it's good, again, to bring these things forth. Last but not least, and with this I want to close, is the topic of nationhood. There's been, in narratives around Arthur Szyk, and we heard them today, lots of work on his Zionism and on support of Israel, but actually anchoring his passion for national symbols and national representations, here are a few of these, into the dirty little secret of human rights that Hannah Arendt had exposed exactly at the same time in her Origins of Totalitarianism in the early 1940s. So essentially the idea that global human rights and human rights are applicable not to all humans, but only to humans who have citizenship, who hold a passport. And so citizenship and nationhood, including granting nationhood to refugee Jews who were stateless and had nowhere to go, was a matter of human rights and not just a political proclivity and tension. So all of these elements of both deconstructing, as I was saying, infra rather than meta, allowed us to actually create a narrative and present it to a public. And I have to say, one small measure of success has been taking this exhibition out of a museum that's a major university, but it's classified as a Jewish museum, into the mainstream. So having this exhibition here, having had this exhibition at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and going through all of the vetting processes for that and passing with seemingly flying colors was a way to kind of triple check that our work of many years could maybe stand on its feet and go into the world. So I'm really interested and curious to see what kind of reaction it seemingly already elicits here at Fairfield and beyond. Thank you so very much for having me here.